Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to share with you a truly incredible story. Think about this. You have a company, a normal trading company, but this company grows so much over time that it establishes its own army, collects taxes from millions of people, wages wars, and eventually governs half of a continent. Sounds like a Hollywood movie, doesn't it? But this really happened in just a few centuries ago. Today's topic is the East India Company, the most powerful, richest, and perhaps most dangerous commercial organization in history. This company's story will show you how modern capitalism was born, how power can be abused, and how a company can be as effective as a state. If you're ready, we'll go to the early 1600s to London's trading centers. By the end of the 16th century, a great change was taking place in Europe. Spain and Portugal had become wealthy with overseas colonies. They were bringing gold from America, spices from Asia. Other European countries were eager to get a share of this pie. Wealthy merchants in London came together and started thinking. India, China, Indonesia, these regions possessed incredible wealth. Black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, silk tea, these goods were truly worth their weight in gold in Europe. A bag of spices could be sold for more than the same weight in gold. The logic was simple. Get these goods from the source, sell them in Europe, get rich. But there was a problem. Going to India was both very expensive and extremely risky. Ships could sink, pirates could attack, diseases could spread. It was impossible for a single merchant to undertake this risk alone. So what should they do? Here, a revolutionary idea emerged. The joint stock company model. Multiple investors would pool their money together, risks would be shared, and profits would be distributed. If the voyage was successful, everyone would profit. If unsuccessful, the loss would be spread. This was one of the first examples of modern corporate structure. Actually, this idea wasn't completely new. In 1555, a company called the Muscovy Company had been established and traded with Russia. But the real big opportunity was in the Far East. Everyone knew this. By 1600, London's leading merchants presented a petition to Queen Elizabeth. They wanted an official charter for their company. The full name was quite long: the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. But everyone would know it simply as the East India Company. The Queen granted permission. A board of directors was formed for the company, one general manager and 24 directors. What was their first task? To send ships to the East and make trade agreements. When the first ships set sail, no one could even imagine that 250 years later they would be governing an empire. They were just going to bring spices. But things weren't easy at all. When they arrived in the Indonesia and Malaysia region, they found the Dutch East India Company there. The Dutch were much more powerful, much more organized, and much more aggressive. The Portuguese were also there, and they were doing everything to protect their territories. The first 10 to 15 years were really tough. Some voyages were profitable, some were complete fiascos. Ships were lost, people got sick, conflicts with rivals occurred. But the company didn't give up. By the 1610s, the company started changing its strategy. Competing with the Dutch in Indonesia was too difficult. Perhaps India was a better choice? India wasn't a unified state at that time. The great Mughal Empire was in the north, but in the south and east there were many small kingdoms. Most of these princes were willing to trade with European merchants. They wanted gold, silver, and modern weapons. In return, they gave the English permission to trade in their ports. 1639 was important. The company purchased a piece of land on India's southeastern coast. This would become Madras. For the first time, they truly had a place of their own. They were no longer just tenants in other people's ports. In 1661, a bigger opportunity came. An alliance agreement was made between England and Portugal. As part of this agreement, Portugal gifted Bombay to England. The East India Company immediately settled there. Now the company had two important bases on India's coasts, Madras and Bombay. These weren't just trading centers. Warehouses, workshops, houses were built. They were slowly becoming small colonies. I must mention a not-so-sparkling aspect of this story. The East India Company wasn't just trading spices and silk. It was also involved in the slave trade. On Africa's west coasts, another company called the Royal African Company controlled the slave trade. To avoid clashing with them, the East India Company turned to the east coasts. Mozambique, Madagascar. They bought people in these places and transported them to India. Yes, you heard right. They weren't crossing the Atlantic to take them to America. They were crossing the Indian Ocean. Most of these slaves were forced to work in factories and warehouses in Madras and Bombay. Cheap labor increased the company's profits. This was a truly shameful period, and unfortunately most European companies and states were doing similar things at that time. But this doesn't justify anything. Millions of people suffered. In the mid-1600s, competition between the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company intensified. The two companies started attacking each other's ships at sea. Trade competition turned into armed conflict. This situation led to a diplomatic crisis between England and Holland. Eventually, three major wars were fought between the two countries: 1652 to 1654, 1665 to 1667, and 1672 to 1674. We call these the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The wars ended in England's favor. Although Holland remained strong, it now had to give the English the chance to move freely in India. Things were improving for the East India Company. But the real leap would happen in the 18th century, and there was one man behind it, Robert Clive. Robert Clive was born in 1725. As a young man in 1744, at just 19 years old, he joined the East India Company. Initially, he was an ordinary clerk, but he wasn't an ordinary person. Clive had military talents. He could think strategically, take risks, and lead. He rose quickly in the company's military operations. By the 1750s, he was already a senior commander. So why did the company have military operations? Good question. Initially, they had a small security force just to protect their warehouses and ports. But over time, this force grew because they got involved in local princes' conflicts, clashed with the French, had to stand against bandits. By the 1750s, the company had an army consisting of thousands of British and Irish soldiers. Also, some of the local princes had formed alliances with them. When needed, these allies could send support troops. Clive knew how to use this power very well. And in 1757, he took a step that would change the course of history. Bengal was one of India's richest regions at that time. Fertile lands, large cities, rich trade routes. A young Nawab, ruler, named Siraj-ud-Daulah ruled here. Siraj-ud-Daulah didn't like the English much. He was disturbed by their increasing power in Bengal. In 1756, he even captured the English fortresses in Calcutta. This was unacceptable for the company. Robert Clive moved for revenge, but Siraj had an army of 50,000 people. Clive had only about 3,000 soldiers. How could he win? The answer: diplomacy and betrayal. Clive secretly made an agreement with Mir Jafar, one of Siraj's commanders. If Mir Jafar switched sides during the battle, Clive would make him the new Nawab. Mir Jafar accepted. On June 23, 1757, the two armies faced each other at Plassey. On paper, Siraj had a definite advantage, but Clive had modern cannons and rifles. And most importantly, Mir Jafar acted as planned. When the battle started, a large part of the army commanded by Mir Jafar didn't fight at all. They just watched. Siraj's remaining forces dissolved under the fire of modern weapons. Siraj fled, but was later caught and killed. The results of the Battle of Plassey were incredible. A trading company had seized Bengal. They now had authority over millions of people. They could collect land taxes. They could control the judicial system. This was the moment when the East India Company's character changed. They were no longer just merchants. They had become conquerors. The 50 years after Plassey passed with almost continuous wars. The company fought in every corner of India. In the south was the Sultanate of Mysore, powerful, organized, and resistant against Europeans. 4 wars were fought with Mysore: 1767 to 1769, 1780 to 1784, 1790 to 1792, and 1799. Each war was bloody and costly, but in the end, Mysore was defeated. In central India was the Maratha Confederacy. Maratha warriors were brave and skilled. 3 major wars were also fought with them. These wars lasted for decades. In the north was the Mughal Empire. This empire, which once ruled all of India, was now a shadow of itself, but still had prestige and some territories. In 1803, Clive's successors entered Delhi. The Mughal emperor was now a puppet of the English. And there were the French. France also wanted colonies in India. They had bases in places like Pondicherry. When wars occurred between England and France in Europe, these wars also spread to India. During the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, the English almost completely expelled the French from India. How did they sustain so many wars? Where did they find soldiers? The company had developed a clever system. Bringing soldiers from England was both expensive and a logistical nightmare. Instead, they started relying on local soldiers. These soldiers were called sepoys. They hired young men from Indian towns and villages. They gave them English-style training, equipped them with modern weapons, and paid them regular wages. For sepoys, this could be a good job. The payment was regular. It provided some prestige. But of course, they were fighting against other Indians. They were being used in the conquest of their own lands. By the 1800s, the East India Company had more than 200,000 soldiers. The vast majority of these were sepoys. This was a larger force than many European countries' armies. How many people were in France's army at that time? Prussia's? Spain's? A trading company had enough soldiers to compete with them. Think about this absurdity. Military conquests were one thing. Economic control was another. The company was tremendously successful in both. The company made money from every good coming from India to England. There, speakers, silk, cotton, indigo, die, opium. Everything passed through the company. The English government had given them a monopoly. Think of the billions of cups of tea drunk in Britain from 1600 to the 1800s. The company made money from each one. Every silk fabric, every bag of spices, all filled the company's coffers. But the real big money started in Bengal. In 1765, the company officially received the right to collect taxes in Bengal. This was called Diwani. This meant regular income from millions of people every year. Imagine a company collecting taxes like a country. Farmers giving part of their crops to the company. Merchants paying a percentage of their income. This money going directly to shareholders in London. The company's directors and senior employees were becoming incredibly wealthy. They were called nabobs, a corruption of the word nawab. These men who made fortunes in India and returned to England were buying mansions, lands, entering politics. So what did this wealth bring to Indians? Nothing. On the contrary, they were being exploited. 1770 is one of the darkest points in the East India Company's history. A terrible famine began in Bengal. The monsoon rains were insufficient. Crops were poor. Under normal circumstances, this was a manageable situation. But how did the company respond? They didn't reduce taxes. They didn't organize aid programs. They didn't distribute food stocks. No, they insisted on maintaining tax collection quotas. They were still demanding money from starving villagers. The result was terrible. An estimated 10 million people died, about a third of Bengal's population. 10 million. A commission report was prepared. Warren Hastings, Bengal's first governor general, investigated the situation. The report detailed how the company had failed. But what happened? The board of directors in London covered up the report. They were interested in profit margins, not humanitarian crisis. Shareholders continued to receive dividends. This was an event that showed the moral bankruptcy of the company's management. People were just a source of taxes for them. Their lives, their existence, their suffering didn't matter. While India was under control, the company was looking for new opportunities further east. China and Japan were particularly interesting. But both of these countries had closed their doors to foreign merchants. China only allowed trade in certain ports under strict rules. Japan allowed almost none. This was an obstacle for the East India Company. The Chinese market had enormous potential, but what could they sell? In 1839, the First Opium War began. Britain's modern navy bombarded China's coastal cities. The Chinese army fought bravely, but the technological gap was too large. In 1842, the war ended. China was defeated. The Treaty of Nanking was signed. This treaty was humiliating for China. They gave Hong Kong Island to England. They granted Europeans trading rights in 5 ports. They paid huge reparations. They abandoned their isolation policies. The Second Opium War took place between 1856 to 1860. This time France also joined. China was defeated again, gave more concessions. These were naked imperialism, forcing a country to open up to drug sales. This is one of the most shameful events in history. But for the East India Company, this just meant business. They made enormous profits with opium money. The East India Company was successful in war and trade, but in governance, it was a complete fiasco. Think about it. You're governing millions of people. You need to establish courts, make laws, build infrastructure, provide education. But you're a company. Your purpose is profit. These two things are incompatible. A state's duty is to serve its citizens. A company's duty is to provide profit to its shareholders. You can't do both at the same time. The East India Company's governance of India was chaotic. Local laws clashed with English laws. The judicial system wasn't fair. Infrastructure investments were at minimum level, only as much as necessary for trade. Education? Almost none. Health services? They existed for company employees, not much for the general public. Social welfare? Completely neglected. And taxes? Mercilessly high. Farmers were giving more than half of their crops. There was no reduction even in bad harvest years. This system wasn't sustainable. Cracks were forming. And in 1857, everything exploded. In May 1857, a garrison in North India revolted. Sepoys, the company's own soldiers, turned their weapons on their commanders. Why? The reasons were many and had been accumulating for years. There were violations of religious and cultural sensitivities. For example, the cartridges of new rifles were coated with pig and cow fat. Pig for Muslims, cow for Hindus, sacred or forbidden. But they had to open these with their mouths. This was a great disrespect. There were economic complaints. Sepoy salaries had been reduced. Their side benefits had been restricted. Promotion opportunities were limited. There were political reasons. Many local princes and nobles were angry that their ancestors' lands had been taken by the company. They wanted power back. There were social reasons. The traditional structure of Indian society was being disrupted by the company. New laws, new systems. People felt like strangers in their own country. When all these factors combined, an explosion occurred. After the initial outbreak, the rebellion spread rapidly. Delhi fell. The rebels declared the elderly Mughal emperor as a symbolic leader. Company control collapsed in Lucknow, Kanpur, and other cities. Thousands of English civilians and company employees were killed. The Kanpur massacre gained particularly bad notoriety. Hundreds of English women and children were killed. But the rebellion didn't happen everywhere. Places like Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, where the company had been established for a long time, remained relatively calm. In those places, the company was more rooted, its agreements with local elites were stronger. The rebellion also wasn't organized. There was no central leadership. Each region was acting on its own. This made it easier for the company to suppress the rebellion regionally. The English response was extremely brutal. Reinforcements came from England. Loyal sepoy units were used against the rebels. Cities were retaken. Rebels were punished. And what punishment? Mass executions were carried out. Villages were burned. Thousands of suspects suspects were executed without trial. The spirit of revenge dominated everything. A brutal practice called blowing from guns was implemented. They would tie rebels to the mouth of cannons and fire. This was both a horrific death and intimidation for the public. By autumn 1858, the rebellion had been suppressed, but the cost was terrible. An estimated 800,000 Indians died in battle, in executions, in subsequent acts.